All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the New Printing Press podcast, where we talk to pastors and innovators and thinkers, and honestly, people who I generally just come across online and find really interesting and want to talk more to. And so I am excited about today's conversation. We have Seth Troutt. Did I say that right? Seth Troutt?
You did.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So you're teaching pastor at Ironword Church in the Gilbert area, Mesa, Arizona area, host of the King Culture podcast, but also I just love your writing, man, on Twitter, and love a lot of the commentary that you're putting out there. So thanks for being on the podcast today.
Well, that's very kind, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's fun to get to be here.
Yeah. I say this to every guest, this is a bit like stepping into Joe Rogan. So your life, you come on this podcast, our reach is so big that your life is going to change. So it's like, it can be traumatic sometimes at what this podcast does for people that come on. So just be ready for that.
I'll be careful. I had a buddy who said his dad used to run a $multi-hundred mechanic business. And so
yes.
I imagine this is the multiple dozens of listeners will
exactly
flock. So
yes.
That's great.
Yeah, exactly. Well, man, thanks for spending some time to chat with us. We were talking just before, and honestly, the goal of this podcast for us and for me is just to be having conversations with people who I feel like are thinking critically, who are thinking deeply, and just around some of the stuff that's happening in church and culture. And I've just really appreciated the voice that you've lent. So why don't we start off by this? Maybe just give us like a quick background, and then maybe catch us up to speed on what made you go, I want to step into the arena of Twitter and start putting my thoughts out there? Because I feel like you kind of came out of nowhere and I started seeing you kind of in the timeline. So just talk to me about background, and then what made you go, all right, I want to start putting myself out there like you have been.
So going way back, my dad's a PE teacher. And so that's kind of a big part of my ethos is there's like a physicality to life and to relationships and connection. And the in-personness of the world is super preeminent. And I was always a bit of a tech skeptic, at least tech nervous, and not just from a slow to adopt perspective, but from an anthropological, what is this going to do to how people connect and relate? Like, I think a lot of my deeper interest in technology developed right when COVID started and people started, quote, doing church online and, quote, taking sacraments online. And my perspective on like the real presence of Christ in the body and blood that we gather together, that the shared table, the shared meal, the shared embodied experience was kind of really kicked off, and my nervousness about Zoom church and this idea. And so I started reading a lot of the tech greats like Neil Postman, Jacques Ellul, and learning about how one of the things that technology does is it erases space and time. And I mean, we're doing that right now, that we are speaking together and we are not together. And just thinking about what it's like. So I got an iPhone in college, but thinking about what is it like to go through puberty with an iPhone, with the entirety of the internet in your pocket, with the capacity to be face to face with someone you're not in the same room with. Like, what does that do for your developmental psyche, for how you process presence and space and the idea of being somewhere versus not being somewhere? Even the popularization of asynchronous education, during modules online, and you're no longer learning with a community, you're doing discussion board chats, and it's asynchronous, it's not synchronous. And so I went and did a doctorate, and my dissertation focused on the developmental bodily self-concept of adolescents who grew up with smartphones and the separation of the physical person from the thoughts of a person. And doing all this reading on tech did not make me even more interested in doing tech. It made me all the more nervous about doing tech. But at the same time, there's like a pragmatic piece of me that was going, I feel like I'm losing as a pastor to the thousands of pings and voices that are bombarding our people on a regular basis. And around the same time, Luke Simmons, who's the other teaching pastor here at Ironwood, came to me and said, hey, we should start a podcast. And my first reaction was, I heard a joke online that was like, what do you call two men who love their opinions about everything? A podcast. And I was like, no, thanks on that. The hubris and the folly of that. And Luke actually
It has
sold
become a meme. It has become the ultimate meme. Is like,
it.
the two dudes with the podcast talking about their ideas, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
And Luke sold me on it more from the perspective of this is going to be an additional touch, an additional drip feed, an additional opportunity we have to speak into the lives of our people. And so rather than just having the Sunday touch or like an additional class people have to come back to, I bet we can get a deeper, longer form conversation about more complex topics that you can't even totally hit in a Sunday sermon. And for the people in our church who want to maybe swim in the deeper end, or who are going to help learn to swim in the deeper end, I bet they're going to love this. And so Luke and I did a podcast. It was mostly him interviewing me. We started off talking through a lot of my dissertation, epistemology process. And so our church is about 2,000 people. And so over time, our episodes get on average about 2,000 listens. And so if you think about as a church offering a supplemental class, a great supplemental class you get in a medium-sized church is like 30 people. Like that's a room, it's a solid capacity to influence people. So what if you got half of your church to listen to a second sermon every week about a complex, nuanced issue, and you could form their thinking in a more robust way? And so the opportunity to, we lament as pastors, man, all we get is these sermons, but people are listening to Fox News 40 hours a week, CNN 40 hours a week, MSNBC 40 hours a week. And you're going, people listen to Joe Rogan for 3 hours. People listen to Jordan Peterson for 90 minutes. People listen to whatever the latest, stuff is. And it's going, people are looking for other inputs. And as a pastor, I feel like I was abdicating by not speaking into an environment and a space, a medium that's there. And so the podcast is really cheap. Lately, I've been having more guests because Luke has been on sabbatical. But for $90 and a $15.99 a month Zoom subscription, I can have these world-class thinkers speaking with me to my people about topics that are really significant. And so it's been a pretty great additional drip feed in there. On the Twitter thing, I mostly I had a Twitter account that I was really passive on, maybe log in once a week, see all the bad takes, get angry, get off, watch sports highlights. I just kept feeling frustrated at how much bad thinking and bad processing there was, and how much just milquetoast Christian thought was being propagated, how much it was like rage baiting fueled, how much of it was just grifting and lame and annoying. And I thought it's time for me to stop whining about it and trying to just be a voice that speaks into the abyss, so to speak. And there's a piece of me that feels like I've had stuff to say, I just haven't said it. And it's like, well, put up or shut up. There's a piece of, if you got something to say, then say it. And as Dan Darling has told me before, writers write. So if you think you're a writer, start doing it. You can't just
Can I ask you a question about that really quick?
Yeah.
So, I got saved in late 90s Pentecostal charismania, and you get saved and you show a little bit of, and I'm implanting a little bit of my story, but I've been having a lot of conversations with people about this. And you said something that I want to get your perspective on. And there was always this, God's going to give you a voice for the nations. He's put a word in you, right? These were the, sort of like Christian youth camp, Pentecostal prophetic words that anybody who could halfway speak coherently would get, right? And I'm still believing all that. I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but there was always this, like, God's going to give you a voice and give you something to say and do something through you and all that kind of stuff. I think my piece of the sandbox in Christendom has maybe, you mentioned the word grift. I think there's a lot of grift that has come from people who go, God's given me something to say, I'm going to say something, right? So I think there's this like thing now where it's like, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to sort of like hide from the voice that God has given me, or God's maybe given me something to say, but I don't want to come across like I'm self-promoting, or I think that my perspective is the right perspective, but I'm just going to lend my voice. So like, give us give us a bit of a window into like your head and heart when you're going, man, I think I have something to say. Because I think we want our pastors and teachers to have a conviction that they have something to say.
Yeah.
right? But then the opposite side of that is sort of that, like, I'm going to build a platform and a name for myself, and I'm going to grow a following and do all the things that come with that. Like, how do you find, I don't know, talk to me through your thought process in that, of like the confidence to go, I've got something to say. I think God's given me something to say, and I'm not going to shy back from putting that into the world. And if I'm putting something into the world, I actually want people to listen to it. I don't want it to go into the abyss. I actually want a group of people to take what I'm saying and think through it. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think whatever your youth camp experience was, I feel like my early rearing was probably the opposite. It was, who do you think you are? That's hubris, young man's disease. And even especially around, so I've been working full time at a church now 15 years. I started off as a worship leader, and then I was like a groups pastor, and then I've been a teaching pastor for about 8. And I've always felt license to speak to the people that I was in community with, because it's like they can call me on the BS if it's there. They can see the incongruity. They can see the flat sides and the sharp sides. They can go and talk to my wife and say, was that really what happened? There's like a naturally authenticating process of a healthy community, that there's like a screening thing. And I've probably admired Tim Keller, who was a very thoughtful person, understatement, but he didn't really publicly write until he was 55 or 60. And in my mind, I've always thought, like, that's the way. That's how you don't churn out vanilla ice cream Christian fluff, is you dig your well for 40 years and then you draw out the water. And I think that's been my kind of default. There's also a piece of me that goes, I grew up around my 18, 19, 20, looking at, the Driscoll types, and going, okay, there's some premature platform there where it's exceeded character. And I've had 4 or 5 like people 10 years older than me or ish that I looked up to, that disqualified themselves from ministry because, they got ahead of their skis and they got too broad and not deep of the roots. The roots weren't there. There's, in Arizona, we have these Palo Verde trees that grow up really fast and they get planted, spread out a bit. And then these haboobs come through, these dust storms, and these trees that have grown up too fast, the roots aren't deep enough. They get blown over all the time, because the deep roots aren't deep enough and the roots aren't tangled beneath the surface. That when it happens in the wild, the roots get stuck together underneath the ground. And so the trees hold each other up. And so an isolated growing too fast tree is susceptible. So I've just been nervous about an apprehension there. And it was really, I've had 4 or 5 mentors over the last couple of years who started telling me, you need to stop being nervous about that. You're like, it's actually like insecurity. It's self-defeating. Your preoccupation with, but what if I become a bad person is actually fall. Like there's a sobriety there, but now you're just hiding. Now this is kind of becoming slowness to use the gift. And so I think it was bouncing it off of community, of my elders, of the people in my circles, and really starting to write stuff and having people go like, this is helpful. It's actually insightful. It's not just rage bait algorithm attuned stuff. And so I felt encouraged as I started to say things, and as people are asking me to speak on various topics, then writing on it afterwards is helpful. And there's accountability there. Like, I don't know how many Twitter followers I have, but at least a couple hundred of them are from my church. And so I know I'm gonna have to look someone in the eye and justify what I said about blank. So there still is a tetheredness to it. And our church is large, but it's not so large that I'm like separated, So if Billy from Twitter says, hey, that was rude, I have to like see him on Sunday morning. That hasn't happened yet, but hypothetically, if that did happen, I can't hide from the Twitter persona. So I feel like there's a forced connectedness that makes me feel safe, because I feel like the absence of accountability would be an unsafe thing for me. And so I do feel like there's enough people online in my church that I can't do the duplicitous, who is the real Seth thing.
Man, that's Uh, that's really good. One of the, and this is not I always try and say this, like, because this is a podcast that we do through Pulpit AI. This is like, it literally doesn't exist to like shill the product legitimately. And I always tell people like, hey, cause I want to get to your thoughts on AI and technology and ministry and all that stuff. And I hope it goes without saying, like, please, say your genuine thoughts on all of it. But one of the big things we were thinking about a lot in creating what we're trying to create is exactly what you just said about like pastor as content creator, right? So I was a campus pastor in Los Angeles for planted a church in 2015. And so up until the end of 2023 was in LA planting, predominantly pastoring people under 30. And we did the same thing in a sense. We started a podcast, very similar heart and thoughts around you guys. Cause we were like summer of 2020, city's on fire. We've been locked down. We're watching our under 30 something church like deconstruct left and right, or we're seeing the stuff that they're posting on Instagram going, oh my gosh, I thought you were a Christian, but you're now saying this. And it kind of led us into this like weird existential crisis of like, have we been pastoring people well for a long time? Which then led us to go, okay, like you said, there's all this content that people are seeing. How do we lend our voice to that? So that was kind of the beginnings of it, which it's then kind of pivoted a few times. And now kind of Pulpit AI has been the thing that's taken shape. But the thing that we've always said about pastors and content creators is like, they're the safest to listen to because they have accountability, right? So when Pastor Seth is thinking through a tweet or thinking through a thought or recording a podcast, you're going, okay, yeah, the greater Twitter sphere is going to read this, but really the X amount of followers that I have who are my church, like everything is being filtered through them seeing it and hearing it, right? And I think that's like a really, like you said, a place of safety. And why I think I love what you guys are doing from this podcast and the content creation is because it's like, it's trustworthy because there's accountability underneath it, right? And to me, that's like such a huge piece of it. What has been the fruit, would you say? Let's not talk about necessarily like you personally on social media, but as you've been putting more stuff out there, as you guys have done this podcast, what would you say the fruit in the church has been? Like, do you have any examples or anything that you can say to, hey, a pastor's thinking maybe we should do this, maybe we shouldn't do it? What has been some of the fruit you've seen from some of this content that you guys have been putting out there?
Yeah, there's three things that come to mind. There's shareability, sustainability, and scalability. So especially one of the things I liked when I was writing PDFs for our church is, so I get questions all the time. What is a church's view on social justice or something like that? And I have a 9-page PDF called a social justice primer. That is a faithful extension of my thoughts on social justice. And so what I can do is I can say, why don't you read this PDF and then we'll get coffee. And so that is a technological. So I think, books are technology. PDFs are technology, podcasts are technology, blogs are technology. It's all technology. And so technology extends myself. So it creates sustainability in that I don't have to deliver 67 personal lectures on social justice. I can write one succinct thing. I can say, read this. And if you still have questions, let's go coffee. Then at coffee, we're discussing material. I'm not just giving a private lecture. Or a private teaching. And so it makes the meetings more productive. It's also shareable. Then so they can go to their friends and say, hey, I know what Seth thinks about social justice. Here's the 9-page PDF, right? And so we can interact about it and we can talk about it. So now it's bleeding beyond me into the church, just like a sermon manuscript or a book would have done before. Same with the podcast. So I have a library of like 90 episodes or so on various topics, from Calvinism to epistemology to gifts of the Spirit to end times to all this stuff. And so the types of questions I get on a regular basis as a pastor, I can send them these podcast episodes and say, hey, why don't you listen to this and then let's do coffee? Because again, now I'm not doing private seminary education lectures, but now we can meet and discuss and go, what was clarifying? What was confusing? What was triggering? What made you hopeful? And we can have a more relational, emotional processing conversation rather than doing private education. And so it's sustainable, it's scalable, and it really serves my capacity to add depth and breadth to people's process. And so even I just had an episode on singleness come out, and I get questions about that a lot. And so it just helps shepherding people, and it helps people invite other people to church. So we've had people come to our church because I did a podcast on the mark of the beast and the vaccine, and people are freaking out. And I did a whole podcast on it, and then people share their friends, and they go like, "Oh, this helps me feel less afraid." And that guy's voice on this topic makes me feel safe. And so maybe I'm going to go to that church instead of the kind of online troll community I've been a part of. I'm going to go to a place where I can get in person, because they have all these unchurched people who are looking up on YouTube why the world is ending, and having it located to a person serves the process. So there's shepherding, scalability, shareability, and the sustainability piece, because it lives there forever. You know, if I get a question in 5 years about the mark of the beast, I still have that podcast and I can share it with someone, and I don't have to go and refresh all of my thinking on mark of the beast. I can just send it to them and then meet with them. And so it's not avoiding in-person shepherding, but it's adding substance and depth to it. So it's still trying to land in a physical space, meeting with someone and being their pastor. But what happens is as the tech serves as a catalyst to make sure that those meetings are actually more enriching and more substantive.
How would you say you guys differentiate between things like podcast topics and what you preach about on a Sunday? Because it would seem to me that people are wanting more. I mean, I was just looking at the topics on your podcast recently. So it's everything from politics, talking about faithfully engaging in politics with, Josh Butler, to like psychedelics, to singleness, right? And I feel like we're in this world where people want to, hear more on some of these like hot topic type issues. Like I saw this episode you guys did on psychedelics, and like the amount of guys I know who are Christians, have been Christians for a very long period of time, who would be involved in their local church, who have like taken psychedelics within, the last year, some of which it has totally like upended their life completely, right? That's a big topic. So when you guys are thinking about some of these topics for the podcast and or your sermon, how do you differentiate, and how do you like balance between like, man, we are living in a crazy time in the world. There is a lot of topics out there that people want to hear about. Hey, this is probably good for a sermon or a sermon series. Hey, this is probably good for a podcast. And is there any like co-mingling there, or do you see it as two separate mediums completely?
The nice thing about podcasts is it's agile, that we can think we need to do a topic blank and we can do it tomorrow, and then we can release it in 2 days if we wanted to. So like we did one on mass shootings and the goodness of God. We did one on Roe versus Wade when it first got overturned. There's like hey, on Monday this happened, and on Wednesday we can have an episode out. We do not need to wait for a sermon series. So there's a flexibility and agility that the podcast creates that we really like. And so that, by definition, the flexibility and the agility makes it serve ad hoc shepherding situations better than preaching on Sundays. We tend to do long book-based sermon series. So we're preaching through Genesis right now, and it's January through July. Then we'll do a brief topical series on lies about love. Then we're going to do Luke for like maybe a year and a half. And so like that's like the opposite of whatever the podcast is, because a lot of our philosophy on preaching is what you win them with, you keep them with, and what you win them with, you win them to. And so I do want to over time be forming our people on the meat and veggies of your spiritual well-being is the slow, prayerful reading of Scripture. It's not hot topics, whatever the algorithm decides is a big deal this week. And so there is like a cultural, timely thing that's like, I don't care what happened in the world this week. On Sunday, we're preaching Genesis 34 because God stands outside of time and above and beyond the seasons. And so there's something formative there in the preaching calendar that I like. That I also go, there's a lot of pressure, I think, when you're doing a lot of topical preaching to like come up with stuff. Whereas I feel like there's a laziness to me that goes, we picked Genesis, so I don't have to make a decision about what to preach for 7 more months. So there's like an economy of decision making there that I like as well. And I also want people to walk away going, man, I understand the books of the Bible better by virtue of being part of this church for a handful of years. That if I've only been here 4 years, I've heard them preach a whole Old Testament book, a whole New Testament book, a whole gospel, a whole Pauline epistle, one of the prophets. And so they kind of learn how to read their Bibles over time by virtue of being under preaching. Whereas with podcast, I feel more freedom to go like doing systematic theology, Christian ethics. Here's a verse, here's a verse, here's a verse, here's this verse applied to this, a poignant cultural issue. And for example, like take the topic of singleness. If I did a whole sermon series on singleness, that does not apply to most of the church most of the time. Whereas Genesis 34 applies to all of the church all the time. Does that make sense? So
totally.
So a podcast, I can release something that hits a niche topic, and I do not care if half the church does not care. That's fine.
Yeah.
Whereas if I preach a sermon and half the church doesn't care, that's a big opportunity missed. Someone invited a guest this week, and the topic was psychedelics, and it's like the 69-year-old who's is like, what even is this garbage? And so, or I do a topic on retirement, and guess who does not care one bit is the 17-year-old in the room or the 26-year-old in the room. I can do a podcast on retirement, and the people who care will find it and listen. And so there's a capacity to zoom in on things on the podcast or in the writing that I think is kind of inappropriate for the pulpit, or at least it's not helpful in the pulpit, besides like an aside that sats for 4 or 5 minutes.
I love that. Okay. One more question on some of your sort of thoughts around content and Twitter and all that stuff. And then I want to get to just briefly some thoughts on some tech and AI. So part of the being online, and posting thoughts and ideas is those ideas are being put out there to be pushed back against and critiqued and quote tweeted or memed or whatever way you look at it. One of the things that I really like about how you approach X is that you're not afraid to comment on something or to come with a different perspective, but you're not a jerk at the same time. How do you feel about it?
That's nice to hear.
And look, I tend to be more sarcastic and a bit more like, like that just is by nature my personality, and it's something I'm always having to like find the balance in, right? Where do you think in terms of like, and a lot of it on X is like pastors arguing with pastors. It's not like most pastors aren't arguing with their congregation about something on Twitter. It's like, me going back and forth with somebody in a different part of the country who didn't like something I said or whatever. Like my thoughts on it is if you put your ideas out into the world, you need to be prepared for those ideas to be critiqued or to be made fun of or to be quote tweeted or whatever. How do you find the balance between like how you engage in that stuff and how you don't? And then has there ever been a time where someone's been like, yeah, too far? Like there's been a couple times for me where like people in my life have been like, hey man, that was a little too much. Like or hey, the last couple of weeks, you've really kind of been coming across like this. Okay. You need to dial it back a bit. Like, and I'm not asking you for like some sort of personal story, but how do you navigate that? That discourse?
I think I have one personal story is, there was some article that was posted in the American Reformer about basically why the Dutch neo-Calvinists were stupid. And I have like 5 shelves of those, the Dutch neo-Calvinists, the Kuiper Baving, involved in my dissertation. I read the article. I thought the article was stupid, and I commented on it. This article is stupid. And that was my only thing. And then some other guy who's some Baptist guy from somewhere, I don't even know who he is. He said that was a sub-Christian response. And I thought, yeah, he's right. So I said, you guys are right. I'm sorry. Here's my more thoughtful reason of why I think this article is not a good article. And so it was one of those, like, there is like that understanding what your triggers are of like, what am I going to be the most tempted to like roll my eyes at and go, these idiots, and going, that's lame interaction. I'm not making them better by interacting like that. If I think that they're missing something, then I should tell them with substance and kindness why they're missing something. And So the dunking on someone only makes you feel better for a little bit, but doesn't actually make the world better. And it's not loving your neighbor. And so it is sub-Christian. And so I think it's important that we do ministry congruently with the Spirit of Christ everywhere. And there is like that. I do have filters in my mind that like if person X, Y, and Z from the church sees this, how they experience it, what they think. And I think that's one of the, like, how would I say this to someone to their face? Well, I want to say it that way online if possible. I don't think I'm always able to perfectly match my written voice to my spoken voice, but that's what I'm trying to do. And I do think that, so I get blocked by a lot of people on Twitter for having what I think is respectful pushback, and I just get blocked, especially like some kind of right wing people who love dunking on people. I'm like, hey, that's actually not what they think. They think this, and then I find out that I'm blocked, and I'm like, well, that kind of stinks. And so that to me is like kind of beta male stuff, and especially like with the people online who posture themselves as like tough guys, truth tellers, and then you give like reasonable, thoughtful pushback that's kind, and it's just like blocked. And so that's lame. And so I just don't want to be that guy. I don't want to make it worse. And I want to believe that there's a reap what you sow dynamic and how that's played out, that if I create an angry online persona, then I will reap angry online personas. So that's part of the biblical understanding of reap what you sow. And that's how the algorithm works, is what you want to see, it keeps showing you. And so the algorithm does tell you the truth about you. Unfortunately, if you keep seeing stuff that makes you mad, then the algorithm is letting you know, I guess you're here to be mad, because the posts you linger on, interact with are these types of posts. And so there is like a heart check dynamic to the algorithm that you have to deal with.
That's so true. That is so true. And I feel like these days, even it's switching so much faster. Like I can go down, it's like Mavs playoffs. Like I can go down a Mavs playoff rabbit hole. And then for the next 3 days, that's all it is. But then the next day I click on something about like venture capital investing. And then for the next 5 days, that's all I see. It's crazy how it is just like goes from thing to thing now.
There's a reason these companies are worth billions of dollars. It's because they're good at what they're doing most of the time.
Yes. So let's just kind of, as we close here, talk about AI and technology in church. So one of the things that we're always sorting through, and again, I always sort of say we as a company, and me, frankly, as a person, tripped and fell into being this guy who I guess has something to say about the use of technology and AI in the church, right? And we didn't even think about that super deeply, because I guess we didn't realize the gravity of the arguments that were happening across the body of Christ on how and why all of this stuff should be used. What would your thoughts be on, as a pastor and a preacher and a teacher, how are you thinking about the use of AI in any form of it? Yeah, just give me your kind of initial thoughts on, not necessarily big macro, but like micro. You're someone who creates content, you study, you write, you preach, you teach. Where are the lines in your personal conviction about how this stuff should or shouldn't be used? Yeah,
so I think there's a handful of books that have been written, like these like 4 views books, where there's 4 views on the millennium, and you get this book, you hold it in your hand, and it's 4 different thinkers plus their editors plus the publishing company who have been working for 3 years to produce this insightful personal summary of thousands of years of debates. And the way I think about AI is it's like that, but in 4 seconds. It is synthesizing, summarizing hundreds or thousands of thinkers on a various topic and delivering it to you. So like I like the app Perplexity because it gives you footnotes. It tells you where to draw stuff from. And so just like if I'm going to teach a sermon on the millennium, I can go and buy a book on the 4 V's of the millennium and read it. But then I also need to probably spend time in the original sources and commentaries on John 20, or Revelation 20, written by John, and do my own personal work. But those like 4 Views books are an accelerant. It's like caffeine. It's like gas on fire. It gets me from 0 to 20% really fast. And I think AI is the same way. When I'm doing research or writing, I'll go into AI and I'll begin my research process and ask a few questions, and it'll get me from blank page to 2 pages pretty fast. Then I also think about like I said earlier, the sustainability, scalability, and shareability of podcasts. And I go, AI has got to serve similar functions, generating captions, producing questions. And it can't replace the work, but it can get you really close. It can get you pretty far. So you do an AI generated small group discussion questions, and it turns out 9 of them, and maybe 6 of them suck and 2 of them are really good. And one of them, if you tweak, it's going to be helpful. But instead of having blank screen effect for an hour, I just in 3 minutes got really close. And it's like it helps get the creative juices flowing, like a conversation with someone online. So what I think about like AI does on like the editorial process is it basically takes what usually takes 4 years and does it in 14 seconds or something like that. And it can help me be an extension of me. That's part of the reason you asked me about this podcast. I say yes, is I'm not going to get anything from this podcast that I don't actually think or believe, but this is going to be an extension of me. It's going to live somewhere, and it's going to hopefully encourage someone. And I think that if I plug my sermons in AI and it pulls out quotes that I can use for social media, or points out blog posts that I can use to scale, that there's people in my congregation who learn in 1,000 different ways, different learning styles. Some are going to really be helped by Instagram posts. Some are going to really be helped by podcasts. Some are really going to be helped by good discussion questions. And so trying to go, how do I just get more bang for my buck on the prayerful research I've already done? So it's an accelerant. It's a scalability factor. So I'm open, but I'm less nervous about it. Just like if I'm going to do a sermon and I'm going to write questions, there's a temptation to plagiarize and call what is not yours yours. That there is that problem with artificial intelligence. Here, if I don't make something mine, if I don't really put my human touch on it, then it's plagiarism. And I don't care if I'm plagiarizing Herman Bavinck or the AI generated content. Like I need to be aware of the temptation to put my name on something that I didn't make, rather than like using something as ingredients in something that I'm making. Like I can use quotes from people in my sermons. I just need to rightly attribute them. But I can also just be formed and informed by various aspects of things, and then make sure it runs through my heart and my mind, and I say it as my own thoughts, because at this point it has become my own thoughts. So that's how I think about it. It's a tool in the tool belt. And it'd be like if your church isn't using a microphone because you're nervous about technology. I go like, well, this is just increasing reach. That's what a microphone does. That's what a podcast does. That's what AI generated sermon supplementary content can do. So I've kind of gone from being pure skeptic to embrace it as a tool that has temptations and limitations, but I'm a generally positive flinch on this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Cool. So lastly, we are always struggling with, AI. It's new, it's here, it's revolutionary. This is, every church ASAP needs to drop everything they're doing and develop a theology and a philosophy and a framework about, hey, how AI should be used and shouldn't be used. Like there's a lot of noise out there. A lot of it's dying down. I would say a year ago, up until about 3 months ago, it was like the new thing that everyone had to talk about. We're trying to resist some of that because I think our thought process would be very similar to yours. It's another tool in the tool belt. Obviously, technologically, it's changing a lot of things, and it will. But just as you guys as local church, as this thing has emerged, have you felt this need to go, man, we need to talk to the staff about how we're using it and how we're not using it. We need to develop this very buttoned up framework or theology around what we think about it and how our people should think about it, or we should teach on it. Where in the line of super urgent and relevant of a topic is the emergence of AI into the public sphere? Needs to be talked about now, super urgent, to it's just another one of the things in the long list of things that we need to slowly disciple and form our people around. What's the thought around that? if you've had any at all.
Well, I can tell you functionally, it's been the latter. This is one of the topics we got to deal with. Doesn't feel that pressing. There are a few people in the church who are like leaders in digital space on various forms of AI in their workplaces. And so we have some like open-ended conversations with them, like, hey, how's this playing out? What are you seeing? And they're not that nervous about it. The way that the people who work for Amazon or all these other major companies are going, like, the way they're talking about it is this is another tool in our tool belt. We just need to learn how to use it well. And you, like any tool, you can use it morally or immorally. That's just how tools are. So their lack of panic about it, I feel like there's more panic about it in the church space because of transhumanism feels like transgenderism feels like whatever, when like the end of the world type stuff, and whereas like the people who are the leading thinkers on this, it's not new to them. It's been in the works for a decade maybe, and they're going, it's a tool. And so I go, well, if the people in my church are going, this is a tool, we need to use it well, then I go, well, it's a tool, we need to use it well. That feels pretty good. So I appreciate the nervousness and some of the panic, because there is like a, robots preaching sermons thing that is a problem. Christ came in the form of a human, being truly human and truly God. And so this idea of like a phantasm that's going to be a preaching is incongruent with the incarnation. So I'm against, a lot of that stuff too. But I feel like if my people aren't panicking about something, I don't want to be panicking about something on their behalf. I really want to meet them where their anxieties are and try to shepherd them and walk through it with them, and not assuming that I have to become the expert on it. The guy who works full time in AI for Amazon isn't going to know more than me about AI forever. And as a pastor, I don't need to be the expert on everything.
Man, that's so well said and so brilliant. Yeah, that's really good, man. Okay, Pastor Seth, I seriously appreciate you being on here. It has been awesome to get to chat with you, at least digitally, face to face. And we'll obviously link to your Twitter and all the stuff that you're up to kind of in the show notes and all that. But man, thank you for taking some time out of your day to chat with us, and just appreciate you, man. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Absolutely, Mike. It's great being on the show. Glad for what you're doing. Really thankful for it.
Awesome, man. Thank you. Talk to you soon.